The night a disabled Navy SEAL rolled into our small-town diner, he only asked one simple question: "Can I sit here?" But before I could even answer, his canines suddenly froze. The entire diner went silent. Chairs stopped scraping, forks stopped moving, even the cook behind the grill leaned forward. Because that dog wasn't looking at the man who asked for the seat. He was staring straight at someone else, someone who had been lying to all of us for years. Before I begin, if you've ever witnessed a moment that changed the way you see people forever, please like, leave a comment, and subscribe to Storyflow Diaries. The diner where I worked sat on the corner of Maple and 4th, a place most folks in town called home at least once a week. It wasn't fancy. The vinyl booths had small cracks along the seams, the coffee mugs never quite matched, and the bell above the door had a squeak that our owner Harold kept promising he'd fix someday. But people came anyway, mostly because it felt safe there, familiar, predictable. I'd been a waitress there for almost 7 years by the time that night happened, long enough to know exactly which regular wanted extra pickles on their burger, which truck drivers preferred their eggs over easy, and which couples would quietly argue over pancakes every Sunday morning. The dinner rush had just started that evening. Plates clattered, coffee poured, and the smell of grilled onions floated through the air thick enough to make anyone hungry. I was balancing 3 plates on my arm when the bell above the door squeaked. I didn't look up right away. When you've worked in a diner long enough, you can tell who just walked in by the sound of their footsteps. Farmers had heavy boots. Teenagers shuffled. Old Mr. Whitaker always dragged his left foot just a little. But what I heard that night was different. It was the soft hum of an electric wheelchair. That made me glance up. The man who rolled in looked to be in his late 30s, maybe early 40s, broad shoulders, close-cropped dark hair with just a little gray at the edges. His posture was straight in that chair, the kind of straight that came from years of discipline. But it was the dog beside him that made everyone look twice. A German shepherd, big and strong, wearing a black service vest with bold white lettering, Canine Unit. The dog moved with quiet confidence, staying perfectly beside the wheelchair like they were connected by an invisible thread. The entire diner got quieter for a moment. Not silent exactly, but the way a room does when something unfamiliar walks in. I made my way over after dropping the plates at table 4. "Evening," I said, giving the kind of smile waitresses learn to keep ready for anyone who walks through the door. "Just you tonight?" The man looked around the diner for a second. Every booth was taken, except one seat at the long counter where a man in a flannel jacket sat alone. Then the stranger looked back at me and asked gently, "Can I sit here?" His voice was calm, polite. There was something careful about the way he spoke. "Of course," I said. "Let me clear a space." I moved a stool aside so his wheelchair could fit comfortably next to the counter. The dog settled immediately beside him, lying down but staying alert. The man in the flannel jacket glanced over briefly. "Evening," he muttered. The stranger nodded. "Evening." I grabbed a menu, though something told me he probably already knew what he wanted. "Coffee?" I asked. "That would be great," he said. As I poured the coffee, I noticed the patches on the sleeve of his jacket. U.S. Navy, and beneath that, SEAL. I'd grown up in a military family. My father had served 22 years in the Army. I recognized those insignias instantly. "You served?" I asked quietly. The man gave a small smile that didn't quite reach his eyes. "Yeah," he said, "a while ago." The dog lifted his head slightly, as if listening. "What's his name?" I asked. "Ranger," the man said, reaching down to gently scratch behind the dog's ear. "He's better company than most people." I laughed softly. "I believe that." Just then, Harold shouted from the kitchen, "Lena, order up!" I grabbed the plates and started moving around the diner again, but I kept glancing back toward the counter. Something about the man felt different, not in a bad way, just the kind of quiet presence that makes a room shift without anyone saying why. A few minutes later, a group of 3 men came in laughing loudly. One of them was someone everyone in town knew, Greg Carter. Greg owned the construction company that built half the houses around here. Big guy, always talking too loud, always acting like the room belonged to him. He slapped the counter as he sat down 3 stools away from the Navy SEAL. "Lena," he called, "you gonna let a starving man die over here?" I rolled my eyes. "Greg, you've said that every Friday for 5 years and you're still alive." His buddies laughed. I poured them coffee and took their order while they talked about a job site out town. While I was writing things down, I noticed something strange. Ranger had lifted his head. The dog wasn't relaxed anymore. His ears were forward, his body stiff, and his eyes were locked on Greg Carter. At first, I thought maybe Greg had dropped food or something, but then Ranger slowly stood up. Every movement was controlled, silent. The Navy SEAL noticed immediately. His hand rested lightly on the dog's back. "Easy, boy," he murmured. But Ranger didn't look away, not even for a second. Across the counter, Greg kept talking loudly about money and contracts, completely unaware. Or maybe he was aware, because suddenly Greg glanced sideways, and when he saw the dog staring at him, something in his expression changed. It lasted only a second, but I saw it, a flash of something that looked almost like fear. Then Greg laughed a little too loudly and turned back to his friends. Meanwhile, Ranger stood perfectly still, watching him. The entire diner seemed to notice now. Conversations quieted, forks paused halfway to mouths, even the cook behind the grill leaned halfway out. The silence didn't happen all at once. It crept across the diner like a slow ripple, starting near the counter where Ranger stood rigid and spreading to the booths behind us. Conversations softened, forks hovered in midair. The sound of the grill still sizzled behind the kitchen window, but even Harold seemed to be cooking quieter than usual. I stood there holding a coffee pot, suddenly unsure whether I should move or stay exactly where I was. Ranger didn't bark. He didn't growl. He simply stared. Every muscle in his body looked tight but controlled, like a soldier waiting for orders. The Navy SEAL watched him closely. His hand rested gently on Ranger's neck, not pulling him back, not restraining him, just touching him like he understood something the rest of us didn't. Greg Carter laughed again, but it sounded forced this time. "What's with the dog?" one of his buddies asked, glancing sideways. "Probably smells your cheap cologne," Greg said quickly. A few people chuckled, but the laugh faded fast because Ranger hadn't moved, not even an inch. His eyes stayed locked on Greg. I finally found my voice. "Is everything okay?" I asked carefully. The Navy SEAL looked up at me. His expression was calm, but his eyes had sharpened. "Probably," he said. "Ranger's just noticing something." That answer didn't make anyone feel better. Across the counter, Greg shifted slightly on his stool. "You mind calling that mutt off? Some of us are trying to eat." The SEAL didn't respond immediately. Instead, he watched Greg the same way Ranger was watching him. Quiet, studying. Then he took another sip of coffee. "Ranger doesn't react without a reason," he said evenly. Greg scoffed. "Well, maybe he needs better training." At that, Ranger's ears twitched. The tension in the room thickened. I noticed something then that made my stomach tighten. Greg wasn't looking at the dog anymore. He was looking at the Navy SEAL, really looking at him, like he was trying to figure something out. "You from around here?" Greg asked suddenly. The SEAL shook his head. "No." "Passing through?" "Something like that." Greg nodded slowly, but his fingers had started tapping against the counter. Tap, tap, tap. Ranger's gaze dropped briefly to Greg's hands, then returned to his face. The dog took one slow step forward. The movement was so quiet most people wouldn't have noticed, but I did, and so did Greg. "Hey," Greg said sharply, "control your dog." The SEAL's hand moved again, resting lightly against Ranger's shoulder. "Ranger," he said softly. The dog immediately stopped moving, but he didn't look away, not even for a second. Harold leaned farther out of the kitchen window. "What's going on out there?" "I no idea," I said under my breath. Greg suddenly stood up from his stool. The sudden movement made a few people jump. "I'm going to use the restroom," he muttered. But as soon as he stepped away from the counter, Ranger stepped sideways, blocking the path. Not aggressively, just positioning himself there. Greg froze. "What the hell?" Greg snapped. The Navy SEAL's voice remained calm. "Ranger?" But the dog didn't move, and now everyone in the diner was watching. Greg forced a laugh again. "This is ridiculous. It's a dog." The SEAL finally spoke a little louder. "He's not just a dog." Greg's smile thinned. "Oh yeah? What is he then?" The SEAL met his gaze. "Explosives detection, tactical response, former military canine." The words hung in the air. Several people in the diner exchanged glances. Greg's buddies stopped smiling. Greg crossed his arms. "So?" The SEAL shrugged slightly. "So, Ranger doesn't react like this unless he's detecting something unusual." The room went still again. Greg laughed harshly. "What, you think I've got a bomb in my pocket?" Nobody laughed with him. The SEAL didn't smile either. "I didn't say that." Greg's tapping fingers stopped. For the first time, he looked genuinely uncomfortable. I noticed sweat starting to gather along his hairline. Meanwhile, Ranger had lowered his body slightly, not in aggression, but in focus, the same way a working dog locks onto a scent. The SEAL reached into his jacket slowly. For a split second, the entire diner tensed, but all he pulled out was a small leather wallet. He flipped it open and showed something quickly toward Greg. I couldn't see exactly what it was from where I stood, but Greg could, and the reaction was immediate. His face drained of color. "What is that?" a customer whispered behind me. The SEAL closed the wallet again calmly. Greg took a step back. "You got no right," he started. The SEAL cut him off quietly. "You might want to sit down." Greg didn't move. The SEAL continued, still calm, "because if Ranger is smelling what I think he's smelling, then standing up suddenly might not be the smartest idea." A chair scraped loudly in the corner of the diner. Someone gasped. Greg's eyes flicked down toward his own jacket pocket, just for a second, but Ranger sighed, and so did the Navy SEAL. The SEAL leaned forward slightly. "Sir," he said gently, "what's in your pocket?" Greg's jaw tightened. "Nothing." Ranger gave the faintest low rumble, not a bark, not even a growl, just a vibration in his chest, the kind that made the hair on my arm stand up. Greg's friends slowly scooted their stools away from him. No one said a word. The SEAL's voice stayed steady. "I'm going to ask you again." Greg swallowed hard. "What's in your pocket?" For a moment it looked like Greg might run. His eyes darted toward the door, toward the windows, toward the back hallway. But Ranger shifted his stance again, blocking the path perfectly. Then Greg laughed nervously. "This is ridiculous," he muttered. The seal watched him. Then he said something that made the entire diner freeze. "I didn't come here looking for you, Greg." Greg's head snapped up. "How do you know my—" He stopped because suddenly he realized something. The seal already knew exactly who he was, and Ranger never stopped staring. You could hear the hum of the refrigerator behind the counter. That's how quiet the diner had become. Greg Carter stood there frozen halfway between the stool and the aisle, his eyes locked on the Navy SEAL like he'd just seen a ghost. "You don't know me," Greg said quickly, but his voice had lost that loud confidence he always carried around like armor. The SEAL didn't raise his voice. He didn't even move much. He simply set his coffee cup down with careful precision. "Greg Carter," he said calmly, "owner of Carter Construction, lives out on County Road 12, married once, divorced 3 years ago." The air seemed to leave the room. Greg's face turned pale. "How the hell—" "You sponsor the Little League team every spring, drive a black F-150 with custom rims, and you always sit at this exact counter every Friday night." Greg's friends stared at him. Then they slowly turned toward the man in the wheelchair. "You stalking me or something?" Greg snapped. The SEAL tilted his head slightly. "No." Then he gestured gently toward Ranger. "Ranger found you." The dog remained completely still, eyes locked on Greg's jacket pocket. I realized my hands were gripping the coffee pot so tightly my knuckles had gone white. None of this made sense. Greg laughed again, but now it sounded almost desperate. "This is insane," he said. "You roll into town, bring your attack dog into a diner, and start accusing people of things?" "I haven't accused you of anything," the SEAL replied. Greg opened his mouth, then stopped, because technically that was true. The SEAL hadn't said what Ranger was detecting, just that it was unusual. Greg wiped sweat from his forehead. "Look," he said quickly, "maybe your dog smells a sandwich in my pocket or something." Ranger didn't react, but the SEAL's eyes narrowed slightly. "You're right," he said quietly. Greg blinked. "What?" "You're right," the SEAL repeated. "Ranger could be wrong." For the first time since this started, Greg looked relieved. "Yeah," he said quickly, "exactly." The SEAL nodded slowly. "So why don't we test that theory?" Greg's relief vanished. The SEAL continued calmly. "Just take whatever's in your pocket and place it on the counter." Greg didn't move. The room held its breath. "I'm not doing that," Greg muttered. "Why not?" "Because I don't have to." The SEAL leaned back slightly in his chair. "You're right," he said again. "You don't." Greg folded his arms. "Good." "But," the SEAL added gently, "if Ranger is detecting what he thinks he's detecting, then the police are probably already on their way." That landed like a thunderclap. Greg's head snapped toward the door. "You called the cops?" "I didn't," the SEAL replied. Greg frowned. "Then how—" The SEAL gave a small nod toward Ranger. "His vest has a silent alert transmitter, standard equipment." I saw Greg's throat move as he swallowed. "You're bluffing." "Maybe," the SEAL said. Greg glanced around the diner. People had slowly started backing away from the counter area. Not running, just creating distance. Harold quietly turned off the grill. The sudden silence from the kitchen made everything feel even heavier. Greg laughed weakly. "This is ridiculous," he said. "You think I'm carrying explosives into a diner?" The SEAL's voice stayed steady. "I don't think anything." Ranger shifted his weight slightly. Greg flinched. "But Ranger's never wrong," the SEAL added. Greg's breathing had gotten faster now. One of his friends spoke quietly. "Greg, maybe just show him." Greg glared at him. "Stay out of it." The friend held up his hands. "Hey, man, I'm just saying." "Shut up." The SEAL watched all of this without blinking. Then he said something that made my stomach twist. "Greg," he said gently, "the worst thing you can do right now is panic." Greg stared at him. "Why?" "Because Ranger is also trained to respond to sudden threats." Ranger's ears twitched as if he understood every word. Greg looked down at the dog again. The animal hadn't barked once, hadn't moved aggressively, but the focus in his eyes was intense enough to make anyone nervous. Greg slowly lowered his arms. "You people are nuts," he muttered, but his voice had shrunk to almost a whisper. "Then prove it," the SEAL said. Greg's fingers hovered near his jacket pocket. Everyone leaned forward slightly. The moment stretched. Greg hesitated. Then suddenly, the bell above the diner door squeaked again. 2 uniformed police officers stepped inside. The entire room seemed to exhale at once. Officer Daniels, who'd been our town cop for nearly 15 years, scanned the room. His eyes landed on the Navy SEAL first, then on Ranger, then on Greg Carter standing stiff by the counter. "What's going on here?" Daniels asked. The SEAL lifted his hand slightly in greeting. "Evening, officer." Daniels walked closer. Someone reported a K-9 alert. The SEAL nodded toward Ranger. "He's detecting something on that man." Every head turned toward Greg again. Daniels looked at him carefully. "Greg," he said slowly, "do you mind emptying your pockets?" Greg forced a smile. "This is a misunderstanding." "Maybe," Daniels said calmly, "but let's clear it up." Greg's hands trembled slightly now. He pulled out his phone first, then his wallet, then a set of truck keys. He placed them one by one on the counter. "See?" he said quickly. Daniels nodded. "And the jacket pocket." Greg froze. The SEAL didn't move. Ranger didn't blink. The entire diner seemed to stop breathing again. Greg's hand slowly slid toward his jacket pocket. For a moment, it looked like he might reach inside, but instead, he bolted. Greg suddenly shoved the stool aside and sprinted toward the door. But Ranger was faster. The dog lunged forward with incredible speed, cutting off Greg's cloth before he even reached the aisle. Greg skidded to a halt. One of the officers grabbed his arm instantly. The other pinned him against the counter. "Greg!" Daniels barked. "Don't move!" Ranger stood directly in front of him, silent but immovable. Greg's face had gone completely white. Daniels carefully reached into Greg's jacket pocket. The entire diner watched. His hand came out holding something small, wrapped in black tape, a small electronic device with wires. The officer stared at it for a second, then looked at the Navy SEAL. "Is this what I think it is?" The SEAL's voice stayed quiet. "Yes." The officer slowly nodded, and suddenly every person in that diner realized something terrifying. Greg Carter hadn't just been hiding something, he'd been planning something, right there in our quiet little town. And the only reason we knew was because a disabled Navy SEAL asked one simple question: "Can I sit here?" For a moment, no one in the diner moved. Officer Daniels held the small taped device in his hand like it might suddenly come alive. His partner had Greg's arms pinned behind his back against the counter, but Greg had stopped struggling. The fight had drained out of him as quickly as it had appeared. "What is that?" Harold asked from behind the kitchen window, his voice barely louder than a whisper. Daniels didn't answer immediately. His eyes stayed fixed on the object. Then he carefully placed it on the counter. "It looks like a trigger," he said quietly. A woman in one of the booths gasped. My stomach dropped. "A trigger for what?" someone else asked. The Navy SEAL spoke before Daniels could answer. "For something that isn't here," he said calmly. Every head turned toward him. Daniels nodded slowly. "That's what I'm thinking, too." The second officer tightened the handcuffs around Greg's wrists. "Greg Carter, you are being detained until we figure out exactly what this is." Greg didn't look at them. He was staring at the Navy SEAL. "You," Greg muttered through clenched teeth. You ruined everything. The words felt heavy in the air. Daniels frowned. What does that mean, Greg? But Greg stayed silent. Ranger had moved back beside the seal's wheelchair again, calm now, but still watching Greg closely. I finally realized I hadn't moved in several minutes. My heart was still pounding. Daniels turned toward the seal. Sir, he said carefully, can you explain how your dog picked this up? The seal gave a small nod. Ranger was trained to detect certain chemical compounds, explosives, accelerants, and electronic components associated with detonators. Daniels looked back at the device on the counter. And he smelled that through the jacket? Yes. Greg let out a bitter laugh. You think that thing proves anything, he said. Daniels ignored him. Instead, he picked up his radio. I'm going to need bomb squad support at Maple and 4th. Possible detonation device recovered. The word bomb made the diner erupt in nervous whispers. Bomb squad, detonation device. Those weren't words people expected to hear in our town. The second officer guided Greg toward a chair. Sit. Greg dropped into it reluctantly. His earlier arrogance had completely vanished. Daniels turned back to the seal. What's your name, sir? The man paused for a moment. Then he said, Daniel Mercer. Former military? Yes. Daniels nodded toward Ranger. And this is Ranger? Correct. I noticed something then. Mercer hadn't once tried to make himself the center of attention. He spoke calmly, directly, like this was just another day. Meanwhile, half the diner was still staring at Greg like they'd never seen him before. Because honestly, we hadn't. The Greg Carter we knew was loud and confident and full of big talk about building houses and donating to the local baseball team. The man sitting in that chair now looked smaller somehow, cornered. Daniels leaned against the counter. Greg, he said slowly, why were you carrying a detonator? Greg smirked weakly. Maybe I like gadgets. Daniels didn't smile. You planning to use it tonight? Greg didn't answer. Daniels sighed and rubbed his forehead. Look, he said, bomb squad will figure this out soon enough. Greg finally looked up. You people don't understand, he muttered. Daniels raised an eyebrow. Then explain it. Greg's eyes flicked toward Mercer, then toward Ranger, then back at Daniels. You ever feel like a town owes you something? Daniels didn't respond. Greg continued. You build half the homes here, you hire half the workers, you keep the economy moving. He leaned forward slightly despite the cuffs. And still, people treat you like you're nothing special. One of the men who'd come in with Greg shook his head. Greg, what are you talking about? Greg ignored him. Daniels kept his voice steady. That doesn't explain a detonator. Greg laughed again, but it sounded hollow. You know what today is? No one answered. Today, Greg said slowly, is the grand opening of that new shopping plaza outside town. I blinked. Everyone knew about that place. It had been under construction for nearly a year. Greg's company had built most of it. Daniel's eyes narrowed. You were working that project? Greg smiled thinly. Built the whole thing. The room went cold. Daniel spoke carefully. Greg, where is the rest of the device? Greg's smile widened slightly. You think I'm stupid enough to carry the bomb with me? The words made several people gasp. Daniels grabbed his radio immediately. Dispatch, confirmed. Has the plaza opened yet? A voice crackled back. Ribbon-cutting ceremony ended about 15 minutes ago. Crowds still in the area. Daniels looked back at Greg. Is it there? Greg leaned back in the chair. You'll never find it. For the first time since he'd arrived, Mercer's expression changed. Not panic, not fear, just focus. He looked down at Ranger. The dog's ears perked. Then Mercer turned his gaze back to Greg. You didn't plan this well, he said quietly. Greg snorted. Oh, yeah? Mercer nodded at the device on the counter. That trigger uses a short-range transmitter. Daniels looked at it again. How short? Couple 100 yards at most, Mercer said. The room went silent again. Daniels slowly turned back to Greg. So if the trigger works, the device has to be close, Mercer finished. Greg's smug expression flickered. Daniels stood up straight. Everyone out of the diner, he said immediately. Chairs scraped as people began standing. What's happening? Someone asked. Daniel's voice stayed firm. If the bomb is within range of that trigger, then it could be anywhere nearby. I felt a chill run down my spine because suddenly the entire town square outside didn't feel safe anymore. And Greg Carter, the man who'd been eating burgers at our counter for years, might have just turned our quiet little street into the center of something deadly. Mercer reached down and gently placed his hand on Ranger's back. The dog stood up instantly, focused, ready. Then Mercer looked at Daniels. We don't have much time. Daniels nodded grimly. No, we don't. The diner exploded into motion the second Officer Daniels told everyone to leave. Chairs scraped hard against the floor. People grabbed coats and phones and rushed toward the door in a wave of nervous voices and hurried footsteps. The bell above the entrance squeaked wildly as it swung back and forth. But through all that noise, Mercer remained completely calm. He reached down and clipped Ranger's working leash onto the harness with a quiet snap. The dog stood immediately, alert and focused, as if he had been waiting for the next instruction the entire time. Everybody move across the street, Daniels called firmly. Keep going past the gas station. Harold rushed out of the kitchen, wiping his hands on his apron. My diner, he muttered, looking around like he wasn't sure if he should leave or stay. Harold, Daniel said, guiding him toward the door, we can rebuild a diner. Just go. I found myself moving with the rest of the crowd, but halfway to the door, I hesitated and looked back. Mercer was turning his wheelchair carefully toward the exit. Greg Carter sat cuffed to the chair, with the other officer standing guard behind him. Greg's eyes followed Mercer. You're wasting your time, Greg said quietly. Mercer didn't respond, but Ranger looked at Greg one last time before turning toward the door. The moment we stepped outside, the cool night air hit my face, and I realized how hard my heart had been pounding. Across the street, people gathered in a tight cluster under the flickering street lamp. Everyone was whispering. Everyone was looking back at the diner. Daniels came outside a moment later and shut the door behind him. He turned toward Mercer. You think the device is in there? He asked. Mercer shook his head. No. Daniels frowned. Why not? Mercer gestured toward the trigger still inside the diner. Greg bolted when we asked him to empty his pocket. That tells me he wasn't planning to detonate anything in there. Daniels crossed his arms. So where is it? Mercer looked slowly up and down Maple Street. Cars lined the curb. Street lights buzzed faintly overhead. A few businesses were still open down the block. Then he said something that made the crowd go silent again. If I had to guess, Mercer said calmly, he planted it somewhere people gather. Daniels exhaled slowly. That's half the town. Mercer nodded. Then he looked down at Ranger. Ready, boy? The dog's ears perked. Mercer leaned slightly forward in his chair and gave the command quietly. Search. The dog moved instantly. The dog lowered his nose toward the ground and began scanning the sidewalk with quick, precise steps. The entire crowd watched in silence as the canine started working. Daniels walked beside Mercer. How long does this take? He asked. Mercer kept his eyes on Ranger. Depends on how well it's hidden. They moved slowly along the sidewalk. past the diner, past the barber shop, past the small hardware store. Ranger sniffed along the curb, the benches, the trash cans. Every now and then he paused, sniffed again, then moved on. My hands were shaking. The idea that something dangerous could be hidden somewhere on our quiet street felt unreal. Behind us, Greg Carter sat in the police cruiser now, watching everything through the window. His expression had returned to that smug half-smile, like he thought none of this mattered. We reached the corner of Maple and 4th. Across the street stood the town square, the same place where farmers' markets happened every summer, where kids played around the old fountain, where the holiday tree went up every December. Suddenly, Ranger slowed. Mercer noticed immediately. "What is it, boy?" The dog circled near one of the benches, sniffed, then moved closer to a large metal trash bin beside the fountain. Daniel stiffened. "You think—" Before he could finish, Ranger sat down, perfectly still. Mercer's voice dropped to a whisper. "That's an alert." The crowd behind us gasped. Daniels grabbed his radio again. "Dispatch, we've got a possible device at the town square trash receptacle. Clear the area immediately." Mercer rolled closer, but not too close. He studied the bin carefully. "Don't touch it," he warned. Daniels nodded. "Already ahead of you." Within seconds, the other officer began pushing people farther back. "Everyone move past the gas station, now!" The crowd shuffled backward nervously. Someone started crying. I felt my chest tighten as I stared at that trash bin. Just an ordinary metal container, the kind people toss soda cans into every day. But now, it felt like the most dangerous object in town. Daniels turned back to Mercer. "How certain is the dog?" He didn't hesitate. "Very." Daniels exhaled slowly. "Bomb squad is 20 minutes out." Mercer shook his head. "We may not have 20 minutes. Daniels looked sharply at him. "Why?" Mercer gestured toward the police cruiser where Greg sat watching. "Greg bolted when we asked him to empty his pocket. That tells me he wasn't planning to detonate anything in there." Daniels crossed his arms. "So where is it?" Mercer looked slowly up and down Maple Street. Cars lined the curb. Street lights buzzed faintly overhead. A few businesses were still open down the block. Then he said something that made the crowd go silent again. "If I had to guess," Mercer said calmly, "he planted it somewhere people gather." Daniels exhaled slowly. "That's half the town." Mercer nodded. Then he looked down at Ranger. "Ready, boy?" The dog's ears perked. Mercer leaned slightly forward in his chair and gave the command quietly. The ticking sound was faint at first. So faint that for a moment I thought my mind was playing tricks on me. But then the wind shifted slightly across the square, and the sound became clearer. Tick, tick, tick. A slow, steady rhythm coming from inside that ordinary metal trash bin beside the fountain. Officer Daniels looked like the ground had dropped out from under him. "You're sure?" he asked Mercer quietly. Mercer didn't take his eyes off the bin. "Yes." The single word hung in the cold night air. Behind us, the crowd had moved even farther down the block now, but nobody had left completely. People stood in clusters near the gas station parking lot, watching from a distance with worried faces and whispered prayers. Daniels grabbed his radio again. "Dispatch," he said tightly. "We have confirmed ticking from the suspected device. Bomb squad needs to move faster." Static crackled back. "They're en route. ETA 18 minutes. Daniels looked back toward Mercer. 18 minutes. The ticking continued. Tick, tick, tick. Mercer leaned forward slightly in his wheelchair, studying the trash bin with careful attention. Ranger stood beside him, perfectly still. "Can you see inside it?" Daniels asked. Mercer shook his head. "Not from here." Daniels rubbed the back of his neck. "If it's on a timer—" Mercer finished the thought quietly. "We might not have 18 minutes. The officer standing near the cruiser glanced over at Greg Carter again. Greg had that same thin smile on his face, watching, waiting. Daniels followed Mercer's gaze toward the cruiser. "He's enjoying this," Daniels muttered. Mercer nodded slightly. "Because he thinks we can't stop it." Daniels turned back to the bin. "So what do we do?" Mercer didn't answer immediately. Instead, he studied the ground around the trash bin, the concrete base, the metal lid, the seams along the sides. Ranger suddenly sniffed the air again. Mercer noticed. "What is it, boy?" The dog shifted his head slightly toward the base of the bin. Mercer leaned forward further, trying to see. Then he spoke slowly. The device might not be inside. Daniels blinked. "What?" Mercer pointed toward the ground. "Could be attached underneath." Daniels crouched carefully several feet away and squinted toward the base. "Why there?" "Harder to spot," Mercer said, and sound would still echo through the metal. The ticking continued. Tick, tick, tick. Daniels stood back up. "Bomb squad needs to hurry." Mercer remained calm. But I noticed something in his eyes now. Calculation. The kind of focus someone gets when they're running through options quickly. Daniels looked down at him. "You've dealt with this before." It wasn't a question. Mercer gave a small nod. "Too many times." "Then tell me what you're thinking." Mercer glanced toward the crowd again. Families, kids, people from our quiet town who had never imagined something like this could happen here. Then he looked back at the ticking trash bin. "If it detonates," Mercer said quietly, "the shrapnel radius from a device that size could cover most of this square." Daniels inhaled sharply. "Meaning?" "Anyone within 50 yards could be hit." Daniels turned toward the crowd and shouted to the other officer, "Push them farther back, past the gas station." People began moving again, nervous energy rippling through the group. The ticking didn't stop. Tick, tick, tick. Mercer looked down at Ranger. The dog remained focused on the base of the trash bin. "You smell the battery, don't you?" Mercer murmured softly. Ranger's ears twitched. Daniels watched the dog carefully. "Can he identify where exactly?" Mercer nodded slightly. "Probably." Daniels hesitated. "You're not thinking about getting closer." Mercer looked up at him. "If it's a basic timed device, it may have a manual cut line." "And if it doesn't?" Mercer gave a small shrug. "Then we'll find out." Daniels shook his head immediately. "No, absolutely not." Mercer didn't argue. He simply looked back toward the cruiser where Greg sat watching everything unfold. Greg leaned slightly toward the window, clearly enjoying the scene. Mercer studied him for a long moment. Then Mercer said something quietly. "He wants us to panic." Daniels frowned. "What do you mean?" Mercer pointed toward Greg. "He expected chaos by now." The officer thought about that. "You think this is a bluff?" Mercer shook his head. "No, the device is real." Tick, tick, tick. "Then what?" Mercer's voice remained steady. "He wanted people close when it went off." Daniels looked back toward the square. Earlier that evening, the plaza opening had drawn a big crowd into town. Families had been walking around the square, kids near the fountain, vendors selling snacks. The trash bin would have been right in the middle of it. Daniel's jaw tightened. "That sick son of a—" Mercer raised a hand gently. "Anger won't help us right now." The officer took a breath. "You're right." Mercer leaned forward slightly again. Ranger. The dog stepped closer to the bin, careful and slow. Mercer watched every movement. Show me. Ranger sniffed along the bottom edge of the metal container. Then he stopped. His nose hovered inches from one corner near the concrete. Then Mercer spoke slowly. There. Daniel stared. You see something? Mercer squinted. A small black object was barely visible beneath the lip of the bin. Wires, tape, and a blinking red light. The ticking grew louder. Tick, tick, tick. Daniels felt his stomach drop. How long? He asked. Mercer listened carefully. Then he looked up. Not long. Daniels cursed under his breath. Bomb squad is still miles away. Mercer rested his hand gently on Ranger. The dog stayed calm, steady, trusting. Mercer whispered something only the dog could hear. Then he looked up again at Daniels. If we wait, Mercer said quietly, people could die. Daniels swallowed. You can't seriously be thinking. Mercer interrupted gently. I've disarmed devices before. Daniels shook his head immediately. You're in a wheelchair. Mercer gave a small, almost sad smile. Doesn't mean I forgot how. The ticking seemed louder now, faster, more urgent. Daniel stared at the device beneath the bin, back at Mercer. The ticking seemed louder now that we knew exactly where the device was. Tick, tick, tick. Each second pressed harder against the silence of the square. Officer Daniel stood beside Mercer, staring down at the small black device taped beneath the edge of the trash bin. The faint red light blinked steadily, almost calmly, like it had all the time in the world. But none of us did. The crowd had been pushed nearly half a block away now. People huddled behind cars and storefront windows, watching with the kind of quiet fear that spreads when no one knows what will happen next. Mercer steadied the device carefully. Homemade, he said softly. Daniels leaned closer but kept a cautious distance. You can tell that just from here? Mercer nodded. The casing, the wiring, no military precision. Daniels let out a breath. That good or bad? Both. Mercer's eyes moved across the wires slowly, analyzing every detail. If it's simple enough, there's a chance we can stop it. And if it's not? Mercer didn't answer right away. Instead, he reached down and scratched Ranger gently behind the ears. The dog stood perfectly still beside him, alert but calm, like he trusted Mercer completely. Daniels glanced at the wheelchair. How are you planning to reach it? Mercer looked at the bin again. I don't have to reach it directly. Daniels frowned. What do you mean? Mercer pointed toward a long metal trash grabber tool leaning against the nearby park bench, the kind city workers use to pick up litter. He followed his gaze. You're going to use that? Mercer nodded, carefully. Daniels exhaled slowly. That's a hell of a gamble. Mercer's voice stayed steady. So is waiting. The ticking continued. Tick, tick, tick. Daniels looked toward the cruiser where Greg Carter sat watching through the glass. Greg's smile had returned. He looked confident, certain, like he already knew how this would end. Daniels turned back toward Mercer. All right, he said quietly. Tell me what to do. Mercer nodded once. First, we need to get the bin slightly tilted so I can see the wiring. Daniels hesitated. That won't trigger it? Not if we move slowly. Daniels walked carefully toward the bench and picked up the metal grabber tool. He handed it to Mercer. The moment felt strange. An old police officer handing a trash pickup tool to a disabled Navy SEAL to disarm a bomb in the middle of a quiet town square. But nobody questioned it, because there wasn't time. Mercer positioned the tool carefully, gripping it with steady hands. "Ranger," he murmured softly. The dog stepped closer but stayed just behind the wheelchair, watching, protecting. Mercer slid the grabber tool toward the edge of the trash bin and gently nudged the base. The metal shifted slightly. A faint scraping sound echoed across the concrete. Everyone held their breath. Tick, tick, tick. The bin tilted just enough for Mercer to see underneath. His eyes narrowed. Daniels leaned slightly to the side. "What do you see?" Mercer spoke quietly. "Basic timer circuit, battery pack, 3 wires." Daniels swallowed. "3?" Mercer nodded slowly. "Red, blue, yellow." Daniels stared at the blinking light. "Which one stops it?" Mercer steadied the wiring again. "Not always the obvious one." The seconds continued slipping away. Tick, tick, tick. Mercer leaned closer, examining the small circuit board attached to the timer. Greg had done a sloppy job attaching the wires, tape wrapped unevenly around the connections, cheap components, but that didn't make it less dangerous. Daniels wiped sweat from his forehead. "You've got to hurry." Mercer nodded slightly. "I know." He adjusted the grabber tool carefully, positioning it closer to the wires. "Sometimes," Mercer said quietly, almost like he was thinking out loud, "the red wire is the power line." Daniels didn't blink. "And sometimes?" "Sometimes it's the detonator." The ticking sounded faster now. Tick, tick, tick. Daniels looked back toward the crowd for a moment. People were holding each other, waiting, praying. He turned back. "How confident are you?" Mercer didn't answer immediately. Instead, he closed his eyes for a brief second, maybe remembering something, maybe trusting instinct. When he opened them again, his voice was calm. Ranger's nose picked up the battery chemical strongest near the blue wire. Daniels frowned. "So the battery connects there?" "Probably." "And that means—" Mercer moved the grabber tool closer. "It means the yellow wire is likely the trigger line." Daniels held his breath. "And the red?" Mercer's eyes stayed locked on the device. "The failsafe." The ticking continued. Tick, tick, tick. Daniels looked back toward the crowd for a moment. People were holding each other, waiting, praying. He turned back. "How confident are you?" Mercer didn't answer immediately. Instead, he closed his eyes for a brief second, maybe remembering something, maybe trusting instinct. When he opened them again, his voice was calm. Ranger's nose picked up the battery chemical strongest near the blue wire. Daniels frowned. "So the battery connects there?" "Probably." "And that means—" Mercer moved the grabber tool closer. "It means the yellow wire is likely the trigger line." Daniels held his breath. "And the red?" Mercer's eyes stayed locked on the device. "The failsafe." The ticking continued. Tick, tick, tick. Daniels whispered, "Which one do you cut?" Mercer answered quietly, "The yellow." He positioned the grabber tool carefully around the yellow wire. The thin metal claw trembled slightly as it lined up. The blinking red light continued flashing. Tick, tick, tick. Daniels felt his heart hammering. "You sure?" Mercer didn't look away from the device. "No." The officer swallowed hard. "Great." Mercer squeezed the grabber handle slightly, tightening the grip around the yellow wire. Ranger's ears twitched. The dog didn't move, but his focus was absolute. Mercer inhaled slowly. The square was silent except for the ticking. Tick, tick, tick. Then Mercer spoke once. The crowd slowly began to relax, though the tension in the air lingered like a shadow. People whispered to one another, still trying to process what had just happened. One woman hugged her child tightly, rocking him back and forth, murmuring, "It's okay, you're safe now." I found myself leaning against a parked car, my hands still trembling, staring at the small black device that had almost turned our quiet town square into a disaster. Ranger sat calmly beside Mercer's wheelchair, tail flicking occasionally, his head cocked as though he knew the danger was over but wasn't quite finished watching. Daniels moved quickly to secure Greg Carter, pulling him out of the cruiser and cuffing him for the official arrest. Greg's face was pale, eyes wide, but the anger hadn't left him entirely. It was now mixed with something new, a raw, unmasked fear. He kept glancing at Mercer, who remained calm, like a man who had already seen this play out 1,000 times before. "You think this changes anything?" Greg muttered bitterly. "I still built half the town. People still respect me." Mercer shook his head, keeping his eyes on the device one last time. "Respect isn't built on fear," he said softly, "and it's certainly not earned by trying to hurt people." Ranger nudged his hand with his nose, a quiet reminder that the work wasn't over until everyone was safe. Daniel signaled the other officer to take Greg toward the squad car. "You're going to explain everything to the detectives," Daniel said firmly. Greg said nothing. The reality of the night had finally begun to sink in, and his bravado was gone. The arrest had turned him from a confident, untouchable man into someone entirely exposed, a man whose secrets had been uncovered by a calm Navy SEAL and his loyal canine partner. I watched Mercer and Ranger carefully navigate the square, ensuring that the device was entirely safe before the bomb squad even arrived. Their calm efficiency contrasted sharply with the chaos that had been building minutes earlier. Mercer leaned forward slightly, adjusting the position of Ranger's harness, whispering a few soft words that only the dog could hear. Ranger responded with a slight nudge, and in that moment I realized just how connected the two of them were, not just as handler and dog, but as partners who trusted each other completely with life and death. Daniels clapped Mercer on the shoulder once quietly. "You've got nerves of steel. I've never seen anything like it." Mercer gave a small, almost tired smile. "I didn't do it alone. Ranger saved lives tonight. I just followed his lead." Ranger barked softly, as if agreeing, and then settled back into his usual quiet, watchful posture. The bomb squad arrived shortly after, and with meticulous care they dismantled the device entirely. No explosions, no injuries, just the cold reality that something devastating had been narrowly avoided. A man I recognized from the squad gave Mercer a nod. "Nice work, sir. That dog of yours is extraordinary." Mercer simply nodded, his eyes scanning the square one last time, making sure no one was hurt or in danger. By the time things settled, people were slowly drifting back toward the diner, still murmuring about the night's events. Families were holding each other, neighbors were shaking hands, and kids were asking questions that their parents tried to answer as calmly as possible. The world felt smaller now, closer, like everyone had been reminded that life could change in an instant, and that heroes could appear in unexpected forms. I finally walked over to Mercer as he parked Ranger beside a bench. I don't even know what to say," I admitted. "Thank you for saving everyone." Mercer looked at me and gave a small shrug. "I didn't do anything special, just did what needed to be done. The real hero is Ranger. He's the one who noticed the danger before anyone else." Ranger nudged his hand again, tail wagging slightly. I couldn't help but glance toward Greg Carter, now sitting quietly in the back of the squad car, his face a mix of anger, fear, and disbelief. He had been the most confident man in the diner just hours ago, and now he was powerless, defeated, exposed, and the town had witnessed it all. His greed, his recklessness, and his attempt to control others had been stopped by a man who had been wounded by life and a dog trained to see danger before it struck. Mercer finally spoke, his voice soft but steady. People often think bravery is loud. It's not. It's quiet. It's noticing when something's wrong and acting even when your heart is racing. It's trust. Trust in the dog, trust in your training, trust in yourself. I realized then that he wasn't just talking about tonight. He was talking about life, about all the moments where fear threatens to overwhelm you, and the only thing that matters is doing what's right. Daniels finally approached Mercer, nodding toward Mercer and Ranger. "I'll make sure the report reflects exactly what happened. You two saved lives tonight. You need to know that." Mercer simply nodded, quiet as always. "I know. That's enough." Ranger leaned into his handler slightly, the weight of the night finally giving way to calm. As the crowd slowly dispersed and the streetlights flickered over the quiet town square, I realized something else. Everyone had been watching Mercer and Ranger, but they were more than just heroes for one night. They reminded people what it meant to act with courage when others couldn't. That calm, steady presence in a storm, the ability to see danger before it strikes, and the discipline to act without panic. It was rare, and it was humbling to witness. I walked back toward the diner, now quiet, the smell of onions and coffee lingering faintly in the cool night air. Harold was outside, standing on the steps, shaking his head. "I don't even know what to say. My diner. People were sitting here and it coulda—" He stopped, unable to finish. I just shook my head. "It's okay, Harold. Everyone's safe. That's what matters." From the bench outside the diner, Mercer and Ranger watched as the last of the townspeople walked home. I finally asked him, softly, "Do you ever get used to it? The danger, I mean?" Mercer leaned back, thoughtful. "No, you learn to respect it, to be ready for it, and to trust the people and the dog beside you. That's what matters most." Ranger nudged his hand again, the small movement a reminder that his partner was